When people talk about professional headphones, they mention the Sony MDR7506, the Audio-Technica M40X, the M50X, one of many options from AKG, and some rather expensive alternatives. Recently, I was browsing Amazon and stumbled across products made by Teenage Engineering. This company makes synthesizers, and these synthesizers look pretty neat. But I also noticed that Teenage Engineering also makes a pair of headphones called the M1. This is an $80 headset which was evidently created in-house and is supposed to be a monitoring headphone. I bought the M1. Is it a reasonable option among the similarly priced products, or simply a pipe dream? Teenage Engineering is a Swedish company. They use very Swedish designs in all of their products. There's a sense of cohesion among everything Teenage Engineering sells. The M1 seems to fall into the same design philosophy. This headphone is made of plastic, metal, and synthetic leather. The headband is metal. The ear cups are plastic. There's a rubber piece which sits just underneath the metal headband. This is the only headband padding you get. The ear cups snap into place and can be folded into the headband for storage or transport. The ear pads can be detached, but I imagine you would have a hard time finding compatible third-party ear pads. The ear pads have openings that are about the size of a US quarter. The M1 comes with two microphones. One is built inside the left ear cup. The other is a boom mic that snaps into one of the two 3.5mm jacks on the headphone. The boom mic is made of metal. It easily retains the position you apply. The headphone has two 3.5mm inputs. You can plug the provided TRRS cable into either side. You can plug the boom mic into either side as well. The cable is fairly standard. It's rubberized and is a bit microphonic. In other words, if rubbed against clothing or a surface, the cable will transmit that noise. I was rather surprised by the overall comfort. The M1 has fairly reasonable clamping force. The ear pads sit on top of my ears. The headband never causes me fatigue, though after a few hours I do start feeling some hot spots. The ear pads are well cushioned for the most part. Vigorous shaking of my head does not cause the M1 to drop off. However, jumping up and down or doing any type of athletics with this headphone is probably not a good idea. Overall, I think that the M1 is a rather well-built headphone. I've thrown this headphone in my travel bag, coat pocket, backpack, and have been fairly careless with it on my desk. I have been more cavalier about the M1 than I have with any other headphone that I own. Yet, the M1 has not a scratch or dent or chip or fault. Folded, the M1 is actually pocket-sized. Now, you won't be able to fit this into your jeans pocket, but you can easily slide the M1 in your jacket or coat. The M1 also happens to be one of the most comfortable on-ear headphones I have ever worn. I have a low tolerance of on-ear designs because of the way my ears get pinched. However, the M1 managed a good compromise. There is enough clamping force to keep the headphone on, but not enough to cause discomfort. As for noise isolation, well, you will continue to hear everything around you when you have the M1 on your head. But once you start playing music, most of that surrounding noise will get drowned out. To test the M1, I plugged them into my Creative Labs Sound Blaster G6 on high gain. This is a fairly neutral DAC amp, with the added benefit of having a headset input. I also used the RME ADI2 DAC to cross-check my audio test. I played music through Amazon Music HD. Now, strangely, a few people have been complaining that I use this music service, intimating that it is somehow substandard. Let me be clear. Amazon Music HD provides at least CD quality lossless audio, so those of you who keep griping, just stop griping. One thing I will note is that some people in the Amazon reviews mentioned that the M1 has a distant or muddy sound signature. I definitely experienced that initially. When I first got the M1, I used the stock cable and plugged it into a 1/4-inch adapter, then tested on numerous gear. On each device, the M1 sounded very muddy and the vocals were distant. I realized that the 1/4-inch adapter with the stock cable was the root cause. You see, the stock cable is TRRS. The 1/4-inch adapter's pins were not making correct contact with the pins on the stock cable. When I plugged the M1 directly into my LG V30, the muddiness disappeared. So I used a cheap third-party 3.5mm cable and used the same 1/4-inch adapter. Again, the muddiness was gone. So just bear in mind that if your device is not TRRS compatible, or if you are using an adapter, you will likely hear a muffled, muddy sound signature until you switch to a third-party 3.5mm cable. Teenage Engineering says that the M1 provides powerful bass through its 30mm drivers. They claim that the M1 will reproduce realistic bass response without requiring excessive power. It appears that the M1 has a slight sub-bass roll-off and a marginal mid-bass emphasis. This is not too far away from neutral tuning. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, the M1 did recreate the rumbling at the very beginning of the song. That rumble seemed to have natural decay, but it sounded as if the rumble was just a little less emphasized, maybe by a few decibels. Nevertheless, the rumble was easily audible throughout the song. When the crescendo hit at the middle of the track, the M1 powerfully reproduced the organ, and the rolling thunder effect was easily audible and forward. When the vocals chime in at the end of the song, they slowly rose from the background until they were shoulder to shoulder with the other instruments. There was no harshness or muddiness or distortion at any point during this track. In Conquer by Overwork, the M1 recreated the rolling marble effect at the beginning of the song. The sound was precise. The sound is supposed to pan from right to left to center, but the M1 provided a little bit of that effect. It did not pan all the way. There are several drums in this track. The M1 recreated all of them with hard, precise impact. I could feel the energy behind each drum strike. Now, this was not a V-shaped signature with sharp drum hits. Instead, the drum impacts sounded as they might in a live concert, with the thwacking you might hear if you were 10 feet away from the drummer. The synth in this track was not harsh and was clear. In Irodori, a song by the Japanese drum band Kodo, there are several types of drums, small, medium, and large. All have different tonalities and decay. The M1 presented all of these drums with unique sound. I could differentiate among all of the drums with no difficulty. There's a triangle in the background, and that instrument remained fundamentally clear throughout the track, even when the drums played loudly. I listened to several hip-hop songs, including Pure Water, New Patek, Reel It In, and Uproar. On each occasion, the M1 presented the subwoofer effect. It appeared that the subwoofer was on the other side of a medium-sized room. Consequently, the sub-bass was not boomy and probably needed a few decibel additional boost for a more accurate presentation. The mid-bass was hard and precise. There was very little melding between sub-bass and mid-bass. The vocals were about 2 steps ahead of the instruments and had their requisite sparkle. Overall, I was a little surprised to find this type of performance from these 30mm drivers. The bass on the M1 is not particularly detailed. Consequently, you will not hear nuanced perturbations in songs such as Mountains, nor will you hear the slight tonal differences among some of the same drums in songs like Irodori. However, for raw bass output, the M1 has plenty of it. Sub-bass seems to be marginally rolled off. Mid-bass seems to be close to neutral but with a slight hump. Drums never sound muffled or distant, and each drum impact is energetic. Teenage Engineering does not say how the M1 should perform in the mids region. However, it appears that the mids are fairly smooth, a bit forward, and with a slight sibilance depression, which might be an excellent thing for some people. In Orla Gartland's song Why Am I Like This, there is natural grain and sibilance mixed into this track. The M1 presented some of the grain, but her voice was smoother than what I've heard on neutral headphones. Orla's sibilance is present but slightly rolled off. In headphones like the Sennheiser HD560S, for example, the sibilance is near pain-inducing, and on neutral headphones like the Avantone Planar, the sibilance is a bit more energetic than what the M1 presents. Orla's voice was about 2 steps ahead of the mix on the M1. The guitar and drums seemed to have natural timbre and decay. When the backup vocalist started singing at the end of the song, she was clearly audible in the right ear cup and appeared to be a few steps behind Orla's voice. In Want You Back by Haim, the M1 again showed that it rolls off sibilance. The primary vocalist is supposed to have a bit more energy in her sibilant words, but the M1 reduced that just marginally. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary singer says the word "we" and makes it sound gravelly. The M1 provided some of that detail, but the gravelly nature was not fully reproduced. The 2 backup vocalists sounded clear when they first started singing. I could hear each in either ear cup. When the instruments played at maximum, I could barely pick out the backup vocalists with their individual tonalities. When the instruments played more quietly, the separation and detail in the three vocalists returned. The guitar, drums, piano, and bass all had true timbre, and I could hear the clapping at the 2-minute and 30-second mark. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the M1 accurately recreated the ukulele and drums. The bass was just a little bit further back and probably could have used a bit of an emphasis. The primary male vocalist sounded smooth. His sibilants sounded fairly accurate. There is a backup vocalist in this track, and the M1 was not able to present that detail. Keep in mind, however, that most headphones miss this subtle detail. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are supposed to be sharp intakes of breaths. The M1 did not present the sharpness, but I could still hear the breathing. Overall, the mids are a bit forward. I never heard any great detail in this region. Of considerable note is the fact that the M1 seems to slightly roll off female sibilants. This might be a positive for those who are a bit sensitive to this type of detail. Moreover, vocals always sounded intimate, fairly close to my ears. Teenage Engineering does not say how the M1 would perform for treble, but it appears to me that the M1 has a slight treble boost, though nothing dramatic. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the M1 presented the brass and horns clearly. They had their nasally sound signature and cut through the other instruments. However, it appeared that they had just a bit more energy than what I have heard on neutral headphones like the Avantone Planar and the Allo Audio S4X. This additional energy never became harsh or peaky. The M1 easily presented the instrument group sets, but I could not hear individual instruments. The timpani was perfectly audible and did not overwhelm any of the other sounds. The M1 had a standard stereo presentation. In other words, the M1 does not provide depth or verticality. Whereas the Avantone Planar gives a semicircle of instruments in this song, the M1 had a simple left and right presentation. In Flight from the City by Johan Johansson, the M1 presented the piano as if it was about 5 feet away. The bassier notes melded with each other one after the other, and on higher volumes I heard some muddiness. However, at lower, comfortable volume, that muddiness was not present. The cello was smooth, and it did meld slightly with the piano. I could just hear the electric buzzing through the song, and heard only some of the pop and sizzle that is at the bass layer of this track. Indeed, the creaking of wood and the shifting of cello were details that I could pick out, but these details never jumped out, and I often had to pay close attention. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the M1 presented the piano in the right, the drum kit in the left, saxophone dead center, and the bass layered in between. The saxophone was smooth and never became harsh. It is supposed to have a bit of a gravelly sound, but the M1 slightly hit that detail. I could easily differentiate among the several instruments in this track. Although there was some melding of the sounds, nothing became muddy. Overall, the M1 seems to have a bit of a treble emphasis on some instruments, particularly brass and horns. However, that emphasis does not present additional detail. Throughout this test, I have tried to highlight the details I could hear. In this section, I will merely summarize. The M1 will never satisfy anyone who likes to hear details. This headphone is pretty far away from detail-oriented headphones like the Audio-Technica MSR7B, Austrian Audio HiX55, and not to mention the Sennheiser HD800S. The issue I found is that the M1 evidently was not made for detail clarity or resolution. Some obvious details, such as the electric buzzing and creaking of wood in Flight from the City, were a little hard to hear. Other details, such as the gravelly nature of some vocals, was smoothed over. For a more quantitative test, I used the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I hear in the first 60 seconds. The Full Cal Clear presents 18 footsteps. The Austrian Audio HiX55 presents 15 footsteps. The audeze LCD1, Sennheiser HD6XX, and HD660S each present 7 footsteps. The Neumann NDH20 presents 5 to 6 footsteps, and the M1 presents 4 to 5 footsteps. The results of this test were consistent with what I heard throughout the sound test. The M1 simply hides details. There's a smoothing effect that sometimes causes details to sound further away. For example, in New Light, the first footstep can be heard at 11 seconds, followed a few seconds later by 2 successive footsteps. The M1 presented the first footstep fairly clearly, but every subsequent footstep became harder and harder to hear. In short, the M1 simply was not built for detail. Teenage engineering has not promised detailed performance, so at least the company is not deceptive in this regard. In the spectrum of Soundstage, the M1 will not impress, but I suppose at $80 you should really not expect a whole lot of miracles. In my opinion, the LCD-1, HD6XS, and HD660S have average soundstage. The Neumann NDH20 has below average to, at best, average soundstage. The Hi-Fi Man Sundara and Avantone Planar have above average to just shy of wide soundstage. The Hi-Fi Man Diva has wide soundstage, and the HD800S has super wide soundstage. The M1 is probably just below average in soundstage, similar to what I hear on the NDH20. The M1 has an interesting sound signature and one which probably will not suit everybody. The sub-bass is slightly rolled off, but not by much. There's a mid-bass boost, but again, not significant. Drums hit hard and precisely. The bass never becomes boomy, but is unmistakably present. The mids have forward vocals. These vocals have a sibilance roll-off. This is most obvious with female singers. Those who are sensitive to sibilance might find this to be a pleasant experience. Those who want accuracy will probably not be particularly impressed. The treble is slightly boosted, but not harsh. Some instruments have a bit more energy than what I've heard with other neutral headphones. Specifically, brass and horns tend to be slightly more pushed forward and louder than some other instruments. The M1 has, frankly, below average detail and soundstage. The music you hear will be intimate. Vocals will be close to your ears. I listen to the M1 day after day, and I can say that it does nothing exceptional, but nobody claimed that it would. This entire voiceover has been recorded using the M1's boom mic. The headset has been plugged into the Sound Blaster G6. I have added gain boost and normalized audio. However, I have not added any filters or other alterations. YouTube will compress the audio quite significantly. Consequently, you will not hear the recording at its best. In my experience, I would say that the boom microphone is serviceable. It is no substitute for a dedicated desktop or studio mic. As for the built-in mic, I did not bother recording with that. The built-in microphone requires a lot more gain, which results in far more noise in the signal. Rest assured, the boom mic is superior. I am sure people are going to mention that the Koss Porta Pro and KPH30i are cheaper than the M1, so while we're on the subject, we will quickly compare these three headphones. In build and construction, I think that the M1 is superior. While the M1 does share some similarities in design with the Porta Pro, there are notable differences. For example, the Porta Pro does not have any headband padding. The Porta Pro's headband has mechanisms which require constant readjustment when the headphone is taken off, which is exactly why I had to tape my Porta Pro's headband. The KPH30i has a similar rubber padding on the headband as on the M1, but the overall plastic construction of the Koss products means that they may not be as resilient as the M1. Comfort is subjective, but I have found that the Porta Pro is rather uncomfortable in the stock configuration. I ordered and typically use the Yaxi earpads for the Porta Pro, which do make listening to the Porta Pro much easier. The KPH30i has more comfortable fit on my ear than the Porta Pro, but the ear cups do not swivel, which means that I never get full contact on my ears. I think that the M1 is pretty comparable to the Koss headphones in regards to comfort. None of these headphones is really better than the other in this regard. I have already described the sound signature of the M1. I will briefly talk about the sound signatures of the Porta Pro and the KPH30i. The Porta Pro has less sub-bass emphasis than the M1. However, the Porta Pro also has a bit more bass clarity overall. Going back and forth, it is obvious that the sub-bass roll-off on the Porta Pro is more significant than what I hear on the M1. Indeed, the M1 is closer to neutral. Mid-bass impact is similar between the Porta Pro and the M1, but the M1 seems to have more bass impact energy. Comparing back and forth, it appears that the Porta Pro sounds almost as if there's a slight muffling of the drums, as if there's a thin bedsheet between you and the speaker, absorbing some of the sound energy. The mids on the Porta Pro are a little different. The Porta Pro is more neutral in the mids region than the M1. Female sibilance, for example, is more accurate on the Porta Pro. Vocals are slightly more intimate on the M1. Mid-centric instruments have the same timbre on both headphones. Decay was also similar, if not the same. Treble is actually fairly similar between the Porta Pro and the M1. I think that the M1 has just a hint more treble energy, but it's hard to tell. The Porta Pro does not seem to provide any more detail in the treble region than what I hear on the M1. However, it appears that the Porta Pro renders instruments a bit further away, not as intimate as what I hear on the M1. The Porta Pro has marginally wider soundstage than the M1. I might even suggest that the Porta Pro has about average soundstage overall. As for detail retrieval, neither headphone excels in this regard. However, there are some details that the Porta Pro renders a little bit more clearly. But I never heard any additional details on the Porta Pro that I did not hear on the M1. On new light, the Porta Pro presented 3 to 4 footsteps. The KPH30i has a sub-bass that is similar to what I hear on the Porta Pro. The M1 still presents more sub-bass reverberation than either Koss products. However, just as with the Porta Pro, the KPH30i has slightly more bass clarity than the M1. Mid-bass impact is actually fairly similar between the KPH30i and the M1. The two headphones exhibit similar mid-bass energy and decay. The mids on the KPH30i is noticeably different from the M1. The 30i has more forward vocals and a sibilance push. On Ursula Gartland's song Why Am I Like This, the KPH30i accentuated her sibilance and vocal grain, whereas the M1 slightly rolled off her sibilance and provided a smoother rendition. All vocals and instruments were more intimate on the M1. Treble response on the KPH30i is a bit different from the M1. While both headphones appear to accentuate treble to a degree, the M1 has a marginally more emphatic treble. As I stated previously, the M1 never becomes harsh because of this, but there is a very minor difference between the KPH30i and the M1. Once again, treble instruments are more intimate on the M1. Soundstage on the KPH30i is similar to the Porta Pro. Both are about average in this regard. As for detail retrieval, the KPH30i performs similar to the Porta Pro and the M1. None of these headphones provides a significant amount of detail. However, the KPH30i does seem to have a little bit clearer rendition than both the Porta Pro and the M1. On new light, the KPH30i presented 5 to 6 footsteps. Overall, the Koss headphones are similar to each other. If you do A and B tests between them, you will hear some differences. But it is patently evident that Koss utilized a similar sound signature for both. Compared to the M1, there is an immediate difference in overall sound signature. The Koss headphones have marginally less sub-bass presence, more bass clarity, more soundstage, and separation among instruments. The M1 has more bass emphasis, smoother mids, and an overall more intimate presentation. Where does the M1 fit in? What does it do that is different from other contenders in the sub-$100 price range? You do have plenty of alternatives. The Koss Porta Pro and KPH30i are options that people will immediately point to. For studio or professional use, the trusted M40X or MDR7506 are renowned for their built-in performance. So, while you have many alternative options, you have to be convinced that your $80 should go instead to Teenage Engineering. What do they offer that is different enough to warrant your money? Well, the M1 does fold into a very compact size. I'm not sure that in itself is good reason to spend money, but it's one factor. The M1 does come with a usable sturdy boom microphone. No, it's not the best audio you can achieve, but for those on a tight budget, this headset is a good starting point. The M1 seems to have sturdy build. I have tossed this headphone around and have been more cavalier than I normally am with my gear. The M1 has withstood my aggressive use and does not show even a scratch. The M1 sound signature really is the issue, isn't it? I know there will be plenty of people turned off by the subpar detail and soundstage performance, but the M1 does present a fairly impactful, hard-hitting bass. It has intimate, but never harsh, mids. It has slightly energetic treble. I listen to pop, jazz, rock, orchestral, classical, folk, and electronic music on the M1. I use multiple different sources, and I never heard a harsh sound come from these drivers. I suppose we could ask why so many people enjoy the Koss Porta Pro and the KPH30i. Neither of those headphones has particularly impressive soundstage or detail. Both of those headphones have some funky build issues. Both have comfort shortcomings. And yet, people do enjoy the sound signature of those headphones. I think you could probably apply the same mindset for the M1. Just like the Koss products, the M1 does nothing amazing, but it may be a pleasant headphone for those who enjoy its overall sound signature. This brings us to value. Yes, I think that the M1 is value. I think $80 is probably the limit. For this price, you get good build and decent comfort. You get a headset with a detachable boom mic. You get a foldable, pocketable design. There's nothing flashy about this headphone. I cannot imagine anyone picking up the M1 and being floored by its performance or build or packaging. This headphone's purpose is to give you a particular sound signature in a tiny assembly, and in that regard, it does just fine. Here's the way I look at it. If you want a fairly smooth and intimate sound signature and are not concerned about detail, then the M1 is a good option.